Okay, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. If you happen to be a first-time listener, let me welcome you. Everyone else, good to have you back. This is the first time we are together in the new year, and it is customary for me to wish you a happy one. But I have to admit that in the last few days, every time I run into someone who I haven't seen yet in the new year and we exchange our customary Happy New Year's, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, maybe we should not put too much pressure on ourselves. Not that I'm not wishing everyone well, but some of you know how I feel about happiness as a goal. Maybe I'll just say, have a joyful new year. But really, the reason why it's felt strained to say it is there is some real darkness afoot. And I don't want to get into it. I don't want to get into politics or news, but just to say, I think we need to be very vigilant and not just believing everything that's being said on cable news. And boy, do we need to be shining light. We need to be some serious light, my friends, in the face of what feels like some real darkness. On another note, I want to send profound love to my friends in Australia. There's a lot of people in Australia who listen to this show, and the news of those fires is just horrible. So I just want to send love and safety and some fucking rain, right? It just felt kind of bleak. I was like looking at the news and feeling like, wow, this is really grim. And then I'm like running into my neighbors and I'm like, Happy New Year. And just felt like, ugh. And I'm sorry to be such a downer, but it feels kind of bullshitty to not at least acknowledge that these things are happening. Fortunately, while the longer-term prospects might feel grim, the immediate reality of today's talk is anything but. Seth, Powell, and Chase Bossart are here, and I am beyond excited for you to hear it. We are talking epic level stuff here. So much so that I am going to keep these introductory remarks brief. Before I say a little something about what you'll hear today, I do want to give a quick shout out to today's sponsor, KarmaSoft. If you are somebody who is owning or operating a yoga center, you're probably using MindBody Online, I know. And maybe you're happy with it, I don't know, but maybe you're not happy with it. And you haven't considered looking at an alternative because it seems like it would be too much of a hassle and there really doesn't seem like a lot of other options out there. Well, KarmaSoft is your answer. It's the software that I use to manage my yoga center in Brooklyn. The owner of that company, Rudy Senecal, has been on this show before. You should go back and listen to the episode because we talked all about my experience of using KarmaSoft and how he runs the company because he runs it in a way that's different. And those of you who read my blog post this week about the changing landscape of yoga centers and send me emails, especially you, if you're using MindBody Online, you really need to check out KarmaSoft. I think it's more efficient and it's going to make your life easier. So do yourself the favor. Go to karmasoftonline.com. Also, in just a few days, I am heading to Europe, and this is really going to be the only time I'm there in 2020. So if you're in the area and you want to come hang out with me and participate in my Gentle is the New Advanced Easing the Pain Tour 2020, which I am kicking off in Europe, you've got just a little bit of time to get in on it. I would very much love to see you. I am going to be in London, England, January 11th and 12th. Vienna, Austria, January 15th and 16th. Berlin, Germany, January 17th and 18th. Then I'll be back in the States in Las Cruces, New Mexico, February 8th and 9th. And Sarasota, Florida, March 21st, 22nd. You can find out more about those gigs and more and register for any of them at jbrownyoga.com/tour. That's jbrownyoga.com/tour. Okay, so today's talk with Seth Powell and Chase Bossart is perhaps the most advanced continuing education that has ever been provided on this show. And if you haven't listened to the previous conversations that I had with Seth and Chase, you might want to go back and listen to those first because they are precursor to today. Both of them emailed me after hearing the other person to tell me that they disagreed with some of the things that they had heard. And like I did not so long ago, if you remember when I brought Peter Blackaby and Bernie Clark on together to talk about anatomy, well, I extended the same invitation to Seth and Chase to come have a conversation about Patañjali's Yogasūtras. And boy, did they both accept that invitation. And if you are someone who has a copy of the Yogasūtras that's like dog-eared or has like notes or tabs or whatever, you're one of those people who have studied the text in that way, you're going to want to have that copy with you. And if you're not one of those people, it's okay. It's okay. I'm not one of those people. Honestly, they definitely lost me at a few moments in the conversation. You'll hear me trying to rein it in to have it be clear for those people who maybe aren't as steeped in the text. But even so, it is such a wonderful exchange that you are going to hear. And I've already listened to it twice. I will probably listen to it again. This is some serious knowledge that is going to be dropped on you. So you might want to get yourself in a good way, maybe get a piece of paper and a pen. Definitely, it's one of those. And I'm really happy about it being how we're starting off. Next week, I am going to be returning back to some of the conversations around consent and touch and abuse. I kind of put a pause on that for a little while over the holidays, but there's still more there. But for this week, we're just going to root ourselves in yogic ideas and see if we can have more clarity around what we're doing and why. So I will touch base with you for a brief moment on the other side. But we're just going to get to it, my friends. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Seth Powell and Chase Bossart. Hello.
Hello.
Seth.
Hey, can you hear me?
I can, my friend. How are you, man?
Hey, I'm doing pretty good.
Yeah? Where are you? Are you background on the West Coast?
Yeah, I'm here in Northern California in the Napa Valley, in this sleepy little wine town called Calistoga.
Right. I knew that, but I guess I thought you might have been doing some traveling and then you were back, but you've been back maybe.
I have been doing a lot of travel, but I'm back for just a few more weeks here, and then I head off to India next month. I think I see that Chase has joined us.
Chase, did you just show up?
Yeah, well, thanks for sending me the invite. I was sitting there thinking, oh, I'm missing out. They're not going to include me.
No, we were waiting for you. We were biding our time and checking in with Seth and some of his travels and waiting for you, but you're here.
Awesome.
Well, Chase, how are you, sir?
I'm well. Yeah, good. Thank you.
Yeah, and
glad to be here.
Yeah, cool. And you're at home too?
I'm at home too, and the roofer was supposed to come tomorrow and Thursday, but he's come today.
Ooh.
So there might be a little bit of bumping. And,
all right, that's good. We all know now. If we hear the bumping, we know what it is. Your roof's getting fixed. That's good. I need to get some of my stuff done on my roof, but they came and gave me the estimate, and I was like, oh crap, I don't have that money yet, so we're holding off. So that's good that you're getting it fixed.
Yes. Hopefully it's not going to rain on us while we're here.
All right. Well, this is very fun, you guys. This is the second time I've done this, where I've had conversations with folks and there's been back and forth. And then I say, well, let's get them both on at the same time. I did it with Bernie Clark and Peter Blackaby. We had like an anatomy discussion. And you are both like my go-to guys for yoga philosophy. You both came on, and people emailed me. I had like people in my teachers group who listened to both of those, and they're like, well, Seth says this and Ches says this. Which one's right? And I'm like, I don't know. And then you guys both emailed me too about each other's conversations. So to get us all here together is very exciting and fun. And I just want to thank you guys for showing up.
Well, thanks just on my behalf. Thanks for the invite. It's a great opportunity, I think, for all of us. And let me just say a quick hi to Chase, because we haven't met yet.
I know.
But it's cool to have this opportunity to connect with you in this strange virtual podcast format.
I know. It's so bizarre because you guys both mentioned, oh, we live near each other, we should meet, and you guys haven't. So now the first place you guys are meeting is on this show, and that's its own thing. But that's cool. Chase, Seth, Chase, right?
Yeah. I'll just second those comments. Seth, nice to meet you. And Jay, good to be here.
Very
awesome.
Very cool. All right. Well, listen, I did send you guys a few things that I thought we could jump off of, but we don't have to stick to any of it. I would say maybe the first thing, and it's probably not, I guess none of these, I was like, which is the easy one that we should start with? And none of them were easy. So I was like, oh, well, I guess we're just going to start with any of them. The first one that was really glaring, the biggest one off the top, was this idea of who wrote the commentary for Patanjali's Yogasūtras, and whether or not it was Patanjali or whether or not it was someone else. And Chase had one view, and Seth had another. So I guess let's start with Seth. Seth, what was your view on whether or not the commentary was written by Patanjali or someone else? All
right. So this is a big one, and this could take up the entire podcast if we're not careful.
If it does. That's fine.
But first, I mean, if you don't mind, maybe I can just say a few words just about where I'm coming from and just my approach to, I think, all of what we're going to talk about today, just to kind of put a little bit of kind of like my methodology out there, just let listeners know kind of where I'm coming from here.
I think that's fair. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, I do identify as a scholar and a practitioner, but when I'm trying to read and translate and understand, a text like the Yogasūtras of Patanjali, or we're trying to establish who's the author of a text, I'm very much approaching this as a scholar, okay? And I'm beginning from this, methodological approach of saying, let's try to understand Patanjali and his text as much as possible within his own historical and cultural context. As much as we can, let's try not to superimpose, our own beliefs, our values, ideas of what we think yoga is, or asana, or Ashtanga yoga, or any of these things. Let's, at least in the beginning, let's try not to superimpose that onto the text, but as much as possible, try to let Patanjali speak for himself. Now, of course, this is not 100% possible for, I think, a lot of reasons that we're probably going to get into today. And nor do I think, it's possible to have some sort of pure 100% objectivity, right? I acknowledge that. We all view the world based on our previous education and cultural training, our languages that we grow up with, our karmas and samskaras, Patanjali might say. But as a scholar approaching a text like this and these questions, I'm at least striving for a certain type of objectivity in our interpretation of the text. And I think this is really, really important when it comes to the Yoga Sutra, because there's been so much, I would say, misinformation and very sloppy and loose renditions and interpretation of Patanjali in this text over at least the last 100 years, but we could argue even more. And often these interpretations are being shaped and framed by particular contexts, whether those are religious, philosophical, or, today, even political agendas in reading Patanjali, right? And I think those contexts are often, but maybe not always, different than Patanjali's own, project or intentions in the text. And so at a very basic level, I'm trying to just establish a reliable textual and historical foundation. Okay. Then, once we have at least more of a robust and reliable understanding of the author and its text within its own historical and cultural context, then we're in a much better position to ask, as my late advisor at Harvard, Anmonius would say, so what and why bother? What are the ramifications of Patanjali's system of yoga, a text that was written arguably 1,500 years ago in classical India? What is the relevance of that to us today as modern practitioners, as teachers, as human beings living in 2019, right? But unless we have this more robust and clear and to some extent objective perspective and reading of the text, then we're often just picking and choosing and projecting things onto the text that aren't there. The last thing I'll just say, and I'll finish this, is that I have no problem with modern interpretations or creative applications of a text like the Yoga Sutra in a modern yoga context. I think it can be incredibly powerful and beautiful. But I feel really strongly that we should acknowledge when and how we're doing that, and that kind of act of creative interpretation. And I really cringe when I see those sort of moves being made in a modern yoga context, when these creative interpretations are being passed off as the true original meaning of the sutras or Patanjali, when in certain cases it's so far from what I think we can say objectively the context of Patanjali was. And that out of respect even for the text and tradition, I think we can be more honest about maybe that gap between what we're doing with the text and maybe what the something close to what we think the original text, audience, and purpose was. So I wanted to just kind of get some of that out there in the beginning before we turn to, really specific problems and questions.
I hear that. Let me say, I appreciate that. I know that's a conversation we had in the past, and it's been on the show before about philology and like the set of assumptions of what the reader knew at that time that we don't know. And I appreciate that. But I also want to get to the question, which is, how does that? Go ahead. Go ahead, Jim.
Let me just say what my perspective is here, because I would also consider myself a scholar. I'm an MA in religious studies from UCSB, and I didn't complete the PhD, but I have done many years of Sanskrit studies, both in the graduate program and in India. And I read from the text, but my primary identity is as a practitioner. And, I have been trained by Mr. TKV Deshakachar, who was the son of Krishnamacharya. And those guys are really very solid scholar practitioners. And I could not agree more with Seth that I read a bunch of the translations of the Yoga Sutra and I just cringe and I just go like, oh my God, what are they talking about and how did they get here? And how does that apply to the actual practice and purpose of this magnificent structure of how to be human? And so I'm really also very interested in this. Let's create a foundation and a basis for what this text actually means, and let's come to it with some legitimacy and know where we're coming from and why. So I really believe that this is an important project, like Seth, and I'm going to be interested to see where we get today.
Well, I appreciate that, both of you, so much, because it's interesting. Both of you are what I would call scholar practitioners, and yet in this conversation, Seth was aligning himself a little more on the scholar side, and you were aligning yourself a little more on the practitioner side.
Yeah,
I'm wondering what do you think that difference is? Like,
That's going to come out, I think, as we go through here. So let's go into this question as to whether or not the person who composed or compiled the Yoga Sutras was the same person that composer compiled the commentary on it, because for me, it's very clear that the answer is they're not the same person. But Seth obviously has a different perspective. So maybe we should hear from him first, and then we'll go forward.
All right. So Seth, is that okay? Can we move on to that question? Are you cool with that?
No, absolutely.
So what's your perspective on that particular question about the commentary?
So I think it would be helpful for the audience just to have a little bit of context here for this question. So, because some people I think are very unfamiliar with this idea of that there's the sutra layer of the text written by Patañjali, and then there's another layer of text, of commentary, that's called the Bhashya. And a commonly held view today in India and in the West globally is that the sutras were originally written by Patañjali, and that sometime later this Bhashya or commentary was written by another figure, perhaps someone named Vyasa or Veda Vyasa, or, as I'll perhaps suggest here later, maybe even another Sankhyan philosopher by a different name. If you just ask people on the street, if people on the street had heard about this, or ask people in the shala, or even at the ashrams in India or wherever, that's a pretty normative view of the history of the transmission of this text. That you have a sutra layer of these 195 or sometimes 196, depending on the edition, sutras, and then this later Bhashya or commentary. Now, in the last 10 years or so, as text critical studies in yoga research has developed, a more nuanced view and more evidence has kind of been brought to light. In particular, in thinking of this text and this problem on potentially the work of Philip Moss from Vienna, who really, more than anyone else, has done extensive work on this and working with the surviving manuscripts of this textual tradition. And Moss, and he's not the first one to argue this. This is important to be aware. He's not just coming out of nowhere. He's actually drawing on earlier Indian and Western scholars who have suggested that this is a possibility before. But Moss has now put forth a lot more argument and evidence to suggest that actually there were not two different texts and two different layers, but one composite or holistic text, a sutra, and then an auto commentary composed by one single author, Patañjali. And he lays out a lot of different type of evidence to back up that claim. And if we're interested, it definitely takes us into the weeds, but we can look at what some of Moss's evidence, for this view is.
Give us like one of the big ones. What are the big pieces of evidence that Philip Moss gives that makes the case that it's the same guy?
Well, one, for example, is that a lot of Indian philosophers who are writing Sanskrit texts and commentaries, they quote sections of the Bhashya, of the commentary, in some other text, and they attribute it to Patañjali. They'll have a quote from the Bhashya, and then it says, Iti Patanjalihi, which is a way of, iti is like the quotation marks. And we're talking about people like exalted, learned Sanskrit scholars, like Abhinavagupta and Hemachandra, Sridhara, like really big names in Indian philosophy, who they clearly thought that at least those passages of the Bhashya that they're quoting were attributed to Patañjali. So that's one pretty interesting piece of evidence that within India there was this acceptance and view that the Bhashya.
I have a question.
Okay.
So I'm familiar with Philip Moss's work, and I agree that he is doing very important stuff. When I read him, his entire argument is based, as far as I can tell, not on textual analysis between the sutra and the Bhashya, but upon the historical arguments that at a certain time this person considered the Bhashya to be part of the text, and Is he at all making arguments about the content of the text, or is it only historical about this philosopher considered them to be the same, and that philosopher considered them to be the same?
No, he definitely is. I mean, that was just the first example that I went to, but he looks at.
So let me just counter that.
He looks at a wide range of types of evidence, including philosophical ideas, content, grammar, syntax between sutra and bhashya, like a wide package of information.
Yeah, I'm pretty familiar with his comment, and I don't see the arguments as convincing. I see them as part of the sort of Vedantin take on the Yogasūtras that is sort of changing how we think about them, and not really conveying what the sutras are saying. And just I want to point out one last thing, is that Moss's argument here that at its earlier in Indian history, important philosophers considered the author of the text and the commentary to be the same person, has been reversed in later as in later history, because as it's come down to us now, it's pretty clear that most philosophers consider them to be like different people.
Yes, that's true.
So there's, I'm not sure we should take the earlier view as being authoritative.
Well, again, the citations of scholars is just one example. Now, before I mean, here I'm kind of presenting, and in some ways sort of unfairly, probably even unjustly representing Moss's views here, you know?
I agree. You are in agreement with them, because when you came on the show, that was the view that you represented.
Well, hold on. I am informed by his work, but I don't. I'm not a Moss Svada. I'm not like I'm not a disciple of Moss.
You're not a Moss bot.
No, I mean, I consider him a colleague and somebody whose work I greatly respect. I mean, to call him a colleague is, I mean, he's way on another level than me, but, he's somebody I interact with at conferences and we have exchanges. But I don't agree with him 100%. And I'm actually, I mean, I was going to present some of this, but I'm more agnostic about this question. I have Moss leanings. I think he makes really compelling evidence, and I think it would be helpful to share a little bit more of that. But I do have hesitations, and there's still red flags for me in the content between the sutras and bhashya of things that strike me as a bit odd. Yes,
I completely agree.
Okay, but I more and more I read, and as I reread, because his work requires rereading, it's a really compelling case that he makes, but I'm not 100% on board. I waver in between. But let me just to give
hold on. Let me just say one quick thing here, which is that I am in no way saying that the bhashya is a negative text. There's so many good ideas in the bhashya. It's really an important text. I'm not trying to say that like we should disregard bhashya. I definitely think it's important that we see them as two different sources and two different viewpoints on the meaning of the text. So I'm not trying to say that this is a negative thing. Bhashya is important, but they're not the same.
So let me give just a couple more examples here, though. So what do we have, right? What evidence do we have? I mean, Jay, we've talked about this a bit before, but we have the manuscripts, and what do the manuscripts say? If you look at the chapter titles and the colophons, these lines at the end of each chapter that give the title of the text, they actually don't call it the Yogasūtra or Yogasūtrani. I mean, only much, much later, like paper manuscripts do. The earliest palm leaf manuscripts, they call it by another name. They call it the Patañjali Yoga Shastra Sankhya Pravachana, which is a mouthful that means the Yoga Shastra or scripture, the treatise of Patañjali, which is an exposition on Sankhya. And those manuscripts with that title include both sutras and bhashya together, right? So the earliest manuscripts we have, again, to your point, Chase, it doesn't mean that it's not an original manuscript, but the earliest ones we have, they include these together as a composite text. And one thing that's quite interesting here too is that there's no numbering of the sutras in the earliest manuscripts. And there's not even clear divisions between the sutra and the bhashya in the manuscripts. And this is why...
But that's pretty typical of a commentary.
But this is why you get like some versions of the sutras, like if you just look at different translations today, some have 196, some have 195. Like if you look at Iyengar's, there's just one I'm aware of that has 196. I forget what sutra it is, but there's an additional sutra in that everybody else takes to be bhashya. And Iyengar in that tradition accepts it as a sutra. So there's even, just on the like paleographic level of the writing, there's a really important relationship, we can say, between the sutra and the bhashya. And regardless of authorship of the bhashya, we need to pay really, really close attention to it. And this is often, I mean, for a lot of people listening right now, they probably have never even heard of the bhashya or certainly, read it in translation.
I think they know because you guys talked about it.
Sophisticated listening. I think we should assume a sophisticated.
They listen to the show. They've heard both of you guys talk about it.
No, I shouldn't assume your audience. I say that as somebody who's been traveling and teaching a lot in yoga studio contexts. And oftentimes when I'm presenting the Yogasūtras and I bring up the bhashya, it's typically the first time people have heard about it. It's certainly not presented, say in a teacher training context when the sutras are being delivered or something.
No, well, let me say one.
We're in agreement with that, but yeah.
Chase, let me just say one quick thing, which is that I appreciate what both of you are saying, and what I will say is that this question of whether or not it's one sources or two sources, in my experience, it does matter. It makes a big difference in terms of one's interpretations about what the text is saying.
I agree with that a lot. So this is my point, which is that I really I agree here with Seth that it's not really very important. Did the same person create the bhashya as wrote or compiled the text, the sutras itself? I wouldn't say
it's not important. I wouldn't say that.
Okay, but the point here is not that. The point here is how do we understand the text? And I don't think that these historiographical arguments are convincing to me. When I look at the content of the Yoga Sutra and I look at the content of the bhashya, and it's done a lot. There is so many inconsistencies with the way that the bhashya is talking about things that is different from the sutras. And I think really the sutras are self-referential. They have a lot of clues as to how things should be read back and forth amongst them. And we don't really need the bhashya to understand it. And when I look at the bhashya, it is very heavily leaning towards a particular aspect of yoga. So if we're going to think about what is yoga, yoga is both a state of being, and it's the process by which we move our system into that state. And if you look at the commentary of the bhashya, it is focused almost entirely on the final state of yoga. And in doing so, it makes a bunch of statements that are very detrimental to understanding the process of developing that state along the way. So the problem that I have with bhashya and with using bhashya as the main way to understand the text is that it slants everything towards this final liberation moment And then when we take that as what yoga is, it's really hard to understand, but wait, how do I get there? And so for an example for me is this idea of nirodha as cessation. And, first of all, I don't think nirodha should be understood as cessation. And second of all, if you take nirodha as being cessation, then it's very hard to understand how that applies to me as a practitioner here in my life now. And I can talk about other sort of like inconsistencies, etc. But this is sort of my take on. There's a big difference between the content of the two. And
is that an instance where the Bhashya and the Sutras seem to be at odds in your mind? Like, does the Bhashya translate Nirodha as cessation and you don't think it should?
Well, so for instance, in the second sutra of the first chapter, the Bhashya says that there are 5 states of mind, and they are kshipta, mudha, vikshipta, ekagrata, and nirodha. Okay, but when you look at the Yoga Sutra, so he's saying that the last 2 are really states of yoga, but the first 3 are not. And you get ekagrata, which means like something like one-pointed, and you get nirodha, which is like, stopped or ceased or something like that. When you look at the way that Patañjali puts those in the 3rd chapter, in numbers 9, 11, and 12, he puts the order in a different way. He puts nirodha first. You get sutra number 9 of the 3rd chapter is the nirodha parinama, the change into nirodha. And then number 11 is the samadhi parinama, the change into samadhi. And then the last one is the ekagrata parinamaha. It's the change into the one-pointed. So like that's a significant difference in the order. And to hold up nirodha as the final thing that we do, I don't think is accurate. I can say more, but I'll pause for a moment.
Yeah, Seth, what do you think about any of that?
Well, there was a lot there. But there were some things at the beginning that I definitely disagree with. That, I mean, what you just were saying.
Well, no, wait, go to those things.
I will. I mean, that's an interesting example that you're citing, Chase, of the Bhashya on 1.1, right, with these 5 states. And then those words, the only other place they come up is in that samyama section at the end of Ashtanga Yoga in the 3rd chapter. So we can come back to that, but I don't agree with your description that the Bhashya only focuses on samadhi or yoga as a goal and therefore negates or reduces practice or process along the way. So, I mean, I think one of the most important things that the Bhashya does, and why a commentary, even if it's not this one, but a commentary is so important, is that when we're talking about these sutras, they're so terse, right? They're these really laconic, incomplete sentences.
Yeah, they're a curriculum, not a textbook, correct.
When you say they don't require a commentary, that they have just this internal logic and they can be obviously read and their meaning is obvious on their own, I really disagree with that. And I think it's when the sutras are only read on their own, when they're totally picked up and isolated outside of the commentarial tradition and context, when you get is part of the reason why we get this huge range of interpretations and translations, because people are just filling in the gaps of the sutras any which way they choose. So I think you agree
with you here.
Yeah,
I agree with you. If some commentary is necessary, but I just, where I'm coming from is these masters have taught me how to see what is the points in the text and how they're referencing back and forth from each other. So for instance, in the first sutra of the first chapter, in the commentary, he says yogaha samadhihi, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yoga is samadhi.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, to me, this is already an overstepping. Okay. Because for me, if you look at what Patañjali has put forward, it's not that yoga is samadhi is wrong. It's that if you say yoga is samadhi, then how do you deal with Kriya Yoga? How do you deal with the other 7 parts of Ashtanga Yoga?
The actions that lead to yoga, the actions that lead to
right, but
samadhi.
Are those not yoga? Are those not yoga?
They're the angas of yoga.
Okay, so then you can't say yoga is samadhi and assume that that's the main thing it is, because those angas are not practicable in any kind of intentional way if I'm in samadhi. So now we have a difficulty then for me to say that yoga is samadhi is not wrong, but it's slanting the presentation so far to the liberation moment that it's
so this was one of my big challenges listening to and it was a while ago, but your conversation and podcast with Jay, because I feel like you guys were getting really stuck on this notion of samadhi as a goal and this idea that the yogin is oriented towards samadhi as a final goal. It seems like you guys had a really hard problem accepting that as a possibility in the text. Whereas my reading of the text, what is the final, anga of Ashtanga yoga is samadhi. So it's not like it's just there in 1.2, in the definition of yoga, chitta vritti nirodha, and the Bhashya says that is the state of samadhi, but it's also the culmination of the practice of the sadhana section. From yama to samadhi.
Let me say something. You guys get so deep. Wait, let me say one thing. It's just
a tool.
Wait a second. Let me say. Wait something. Yeah, I don't have a problem with the idea of samadhi being a goal for yoga for somebody. That's totally fine with me. If somebody wants to have that goal,
I don't either.
That's fine. I don't have a problem with that. What I would say is that there are other interpretations. And even when you started at the premise there, Seth, you sort of said that if you just look at the texts alone, you have to look at them divorced from religious and other contexts. But even just translating any Sanskrit, as we've discussed on the show many times, is inherently open to interpretation.
To some degree, Jay. It's not wide open.
No, it's not wide open. I agree.
It doesn't have to be wide open for there to be discrepancies in different people's interpretations of one particular word or half word.
So look, after he talks about samadhi, he immediately starts talking about the results of this. And in all of the places where he gives the highest experience. So if you want to say that that's first chapter 17, if you want to say that that's chapter 4, number 22, some things will say 21, depends on which one you do. After he gives these descriptions of, quote, the highest thing, 18, not 118, not 117, 118. Then he immediately goes back into life.
Sure.
So, and 119, there's application, and 423, there's application. So, there's this, people think samadhi is like this shut off of my brain, of my mind, and then I'm one with my soul, and then game is over. And that is not what the presentation is at all.
But I think the Bhashya is in accord with that, is what I'm trying to say. I think you're right. I think Patanjali lays out these sutras in such a way that he takes you in, he takes you up to the mountaintop, he drops you back down. We go through the forest and cross the river over here. He brings us out, he brings us in. There's a lot of different kind of pathways and margas throughout these 4 padas. And my argument is that I don't think that the Bhashya only leaves us at the mountaintop and is ignoring everything on the ground. So for example, in the Ashtanga Yoga section, This is what I think one of the most important aspects of the Bhashya is in furnishing more context. And Jay, one of your questions was about the yamas and the niyamas. So when the yamas and the niyamas are taken just in isolation in the sutras, they barely say anything. Like, they just list ahimsa, satya, brahmacharya, and so forth. But the sutras do not define them or give them any more context. They're sort of just assumed. But when we look at the Bhashya, it gives us some of the most socially descriptive information about engaged yoga practice in the world in relationship to other living beings, ethical connotations, all kinds of information. That's not just a samadhi view, you might say. And that kind of stuff is often lost, when we're not looking at the Bhashya. So on that note, I feel like the practice sadhana section of the Bhashya has a lot of really rich information, that we can pay closer attention to. And that leaves less room for interpretation, Jay. Less room for speculation about what brahmacharya or ahimsa or these things meant within this classical Indian context. And also to acknowledge that these words and ideas and practices are not all entirely unique to Patañjali, that he's drawing on a shared repertoire of ideas and practices across Buddhism, Jainism, the epic and Upanishadic Brahminical traditions. And so we can't just pick and choose things as we want. We have to understand and locate Patañjali and this textual and practice tradition within this broader corpus, early centuries of the Common Era, right? We have to pay close attention to all of those things.
I don't deny that there's a lot of very interesting ideas and information in there. From my those sections of the Bhashya, of the commentary, I agree with you on that. What I see in reading that is that they're written from a particular segment or a particular view, which is aligned with that this is a practice for people like in the mountains or, sadhus, etc., and that there is a particular kind of way that the slant of even the practical commentary, which again I'm not saying is wrong in any way, but it's the slant of it is towards this high moment liberation piece. And I feel that the Bhashya has not really understood the structure of Patanjali's the function of Ashtanga Yoga. But let's not go into the detail. But even the sutra, even if you just leave aside for now the Bhashya section and you just look at these sutras and its structure, we start with Chitta Vritti Nirodha in this, what is called the Samadhi Pada, or the chapter on Samadhi, on mental absorption. Now, maybe those chapter names came later, but regardless, the content of the first Pada is totally aimed at Nirodha and Samadhi. Which is what?
And Samadhi. Well, we'll get to that here. And then several points throughout, we come back to that. We, as you said, comes back down to real life and practice and obstacles and all of these things. You need to kind of get your mind and body right. And it's not enough to simply just turn the light bulb on, but one has to practice repeatedly all of these things and purify the mind and body of previous impressions. And then we culminate the chapter sequence, or the sadhana sequence in the third pada. We have the whole third pada basically on the actualization of Ashtanga Yoga, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, this samyama, this refined concentration on all of these different aspects of inner and outer nature, entering this incredible mental absorption and acquiring the power and nature of those things, and then culminating again at the end of the text in more exalted states of samadhi Dharma Samadhi, and then at the end of Kaivalya. So to think...
I have no disagreement with that.
Right?
I like that presentation. I'm totally in line with that. I agree with all of that. The question is like, what is samadhi, and like how, and is it a cessation or not? And because like your presentation there, I agree. Very nice.
Okay, well, maybe we can get into a little bit about this Nirodha business, even though I feel like we've both probably waxed and waned about it in other places.
Yes. Well, I will say quickly, it does come to our initial question, because if the commentary is someone else's view of what the sutras are saying, it's just different than if that's what Patanjali intended for us to get from the sutras.
Totally. And that's why it is such an important question that we do have to entertain. We can't just ignore it.
Right.
Because if the Bhashya is coming from Patanjali's own mouth, we can't be like, well, that's not what he really meant.
Right, exactly. All right.
And if it's not coming from him, we can't use it as the basis for our understanding of what this text is. We can use it as a very wonderful way of filling out getting information.
So we're in this, there's a strange dance that we have to do between those layers, depending on where you land on the authorship question. But I would just encourage folks, even if they feel really strongly that no, there's no way this Bhashya could have been written by Patanjali, I still would invite people to read it very closely, because the later tradition virtually unanimously accept it as authoritative. So there's so many other commentaries, from the 7th and 8th centuries and onwards, and almost always, there's exceptions to this, but almost always they're commentating on the sutras and the Bhashya, not just the sutras. So the later tradition did understand it as quite authoritative, and sometimes they differ from the Bhashya on reading certain sutras, but more often than not, they accept the Bhashya as authoritative. So who are we to just totally ignore, 1,500 years of tradition? I think we have to really just look at them closely. That's what I would say.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.